Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the viewport of the Galactic Academy's Xenobiology lab, watching the triple sunrise of Centaurus Prime paint the crystalline spires in shades of amber and rose. 10 years had passed since she commanded the SSV Hyperion through the Battle of Proxima, and now her battlefield was a classroom. Her fingers unconsciously traced the invisible mark where her Solar Fleet Admiral's bars once rested on her collar. The soft chime of the classroom's environmental systems adjusting to incoming students drew her attention. They filed in, a spectacular array of the galaxy's sentient species. Floating meridians with their gossamer tendrils, sturdy graviton students with their silicon-based bodies, and the towering Nixilians with their iridescent scales and proud bearing. Among the latter was Krazax, son of the Nixilian High Council's chairman. His scales shimmed with the expensive chromatic treatments that marked him as part of his species' elite. Sarah had taught long enough to recognize the look in his 4 eyes, the same entitled disdain she'd seen in countless privileged youth who believed their species' technological head start made them superior. Today, Sarah began, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once commanded starships. We'll be studying the evolutionary advantages of various respiratory systems across sentient species. She activated the holographic display, showing the complex biological mechanisms that allowed different species to process their native atmospheres. Krazax's upper lip curled, revealing rows of metallic-sheened teeth. "Professor," he interrupted, his translator barely containing the contempt in his harmonics, "I fail to see why someone from a species that only achieved FTL travel a century ago is qualified to teach advanced xenobiology." The class fell silent. Sarah noticed several students shift uncomfortably in their environmental suits. She'd faced this before, the assumption that humanity's relatively recent arrival on the galactic stage somehow diminished their achievements or capabilities. "An interesting observation, Krazax," Sarah replied, her tone measured. "Would you say that the age of a species' spacefaring capability directly correlates to their understanding of scientific principles?" "Obviously," he scoffed, his scales rippling in patterns that indicated superiority in Nixilian body language. The Nixilian Confederation achieved quantum-fold technology, while humans were still burning fossil fuels. It's simply logical that our understanding of xenobiology would be more comprehensive. Sarah pulled up a new hologram, a complex molecular structure rotating slowly in the air between them. "Can you identify this compound?" Krazax studied it, his 4 eyes narrowing. "Some primitive organic molecule, I assume." "This is Nexaline beta," Sarah said quietly, "a hormone unique to Nixilian biology that allows your species to process radiation from your binary star system. My team isolated it during the Centauri Plague Crisis, when your colony on New Nexus was facing extinction from stellar radiation poisoning. Sometimes fresh eyes see what centuries of assumptions have overlooked." The classroom remained silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. Several students were accessing their data tablets, no doubt looking up the Centauri Plague Crisis. Krazax's scales had taken on a darker hue, a sign of embarrassment or anger in his species. "That was a lucky discovery," he managed, though his translator couldn't quite mask the uncertainty in his harmonic undertones. Sarah turned back to the main display, expanding the respiratory system diagram. "There's an old Earth saying, Krazax, luck favors the prepared mind. Now shall we continue with today's lesson?" I believe we were about to discuss how the Meridians developed their remarkable ability to process both methane and oxygen simultaneously. As she proceeded with the lecture, Sarah noticed the subtle shift in the classroom's dynamics. The Meridian students had moved their floating forms slightly closer to her position, a sign of respect in their culture. Even some of Krazax's Nixilian peers were viewing him with what appeared to be embarrassment. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. She'd seen that look in Krazax's eyes, the same look she'd seen in young officers who couldn't accept being wrong, who let pride drive them to dangerous decisions. She'd learned during the war that sometimes the most dangerous moments came not from genuine enemies, but from those whose wounded pride demanded satisfaction. As the class drew to a close, she watched Krozak's leave last, his movements stiff with barely contained rage. She'd have to be careful, not for her own sake, but for his. She'd seen too many promising careers and lives destroyed by the inability to accept that the galaxy was far too vast for any one species to claim superiority. Sarah turned back to the viewport, watching the three suns continue their eternal dance across the alien sky. Tomorrow would bring another challenge, but that was fine. After commanding a battleship through the Proxima Nebula under heavy fire, she could handle one angry student. The real challenge would be helping him understand that true strength came not from proving superiority, but from learning from each other. The advanced xenobiology lab hummed with the sound of containment fields as Sarah inspected the environmental seals. Today's practical session would involve handling live specimens from various toxic worlds, and safety protocols were paramount. Her military training had taught her that preparation often meant the difference between life and death. Through the transparent walls, she spotted Krozak and his circle of Nixilian peers huddled in the corridor. 2 weeks had passed since their confrontation, and while he hadn't openly challenged her again, his resistance had taken more subtle forms. Missing assignments, whispered comments, and the occasional accidental disruption of lab equipment. Professor Chen. A soft, musical voice drew her attention. It was Mira, a Meridian student whose floating form glowed with gentle bioluminescence. I found something concerning in the specimen database. Sarah brought up the holographic interface. Sure enough, someone had altered the toxicity classifications of several specimens. If left uncorrected, it could have led to dangerous exposure during today's practical. The alterations were sophisticated. Whoever had done it knew their way around Academy systems. Thank you, Mira, Sarah said quietly, her fingers flying over the interface as she restored the correct data. Good catch. The class filed in, environmental suits sealed and checked. Sarah noticed how the non-Nixilian students gave Krozak's group a wide berth. The division troubled her. It reminded her too much of the early days of human-alien integration in the solar fleet, before the Centauri conflict had forced them to overcome their prejudices. Today's practical will involve analyzing adaptation mechanisms in extremophile species, Sarah began, activating the specimen containers. You'll be working with live samples from the methane seas of Titan, the acid rains of Vertex Prime, and the radiation zones off. A sudden alarm cut through the lab. Red warning lights flashed as one of the containment fields flickered. Sarah's combat-trained reflexes kicked in before her conscious mind could process the situation. She slammed her hand on the emergency lockdown control, sealing the specimen container just as it tried to open. Everyone back, she ordered, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. The students scrambled away as she quickly traced the system malfunction. The containment field had been sabotaged, expertly. Someone had created a cascading failure that would have released highly toxic specimens into the lab. The environmental suits would have protected the students, but the evidence of the tampering would have been destroyed in the subsequent decontamination protocols. Sarah's eyes met Krozak's. His upper eyes showed surprise, but his lower set held a calculating look she recognized all too well. She'd seen it in the eyes of enemy commanders trying to mask their true intentions. Class dismissed, she announced. The lab will need to undergo safety recertification before we can proceed. As the students filed out, Sarah noticed Krozak lingering behind his peers. Is there something you'd like to discuss? She asked, keeping her voice neutral. Just concerned about our safety, Professor, he replied, his scales shifting in patterns that didn't match his words. Perhaps the Academy should reconsider having less advanced species handling such dangerous materials. Interesting suggestion, Sarah said, pulling up the lab's security logs. I'll be sure to mention it when I submit my report about today's incident, including the system access logs. Krozak's scales darkened slightly. I'm sure the Academy Board will be very interested in how their prestigious lab was compromised. It might raise questions about current leadership. It might, Sarah agreed. just as it might raise questions about certain students' activities. The Centauri conflict taught us humans many things, Krozaks, including how to track sophisticated system intrusions. The young Nixilians' posture stiffened. The Centauri conflict, a minor border skirmish that humans somehow stumbled their way through. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Is that what they teach in the Nixilian histories? Interesting. You might want to ask your father why the High Council keeps certain records of that conflict sealed. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Kryzax's features. My father. What does he? That will be all. Sarah cut him off, turning back to the safety controls. I believe you have a quantum mechanics class to attend. She waited until his footsteps had faded before letting out a long breath. The mention of his father had been a calculated risk, but she needed to shake his certainty. The classified records she'd referenced contained the truth about the Nixilian High Council's secret request for human military aid during the conflict, a truth that contradicted everything Kryzax believed about human capabilities. Sarah began composing her incident report, carefully documenting the sabotage attempt while omitting any direct accusations. She'd fought enough battles to know that sometimes victory came not from confrontation, but from allowing your opponent to question their own assumptions. Still, she increased the lab's security protocols and added additional monitoring systems. She hadn't survived multiple space battles by underestimating her opponents, and she wouldn't start now. The next move would be Kryzax's, and Sarah had learned long ago that wounded pride could be more dangerous than any weapon. As she worked, her hand unconsciously touched the small scar at her temple, a reminder of the day she'd earned her first command. It had been another lesson in pride and prejudice, one that had cost lives to learn. She could only hope Kryzax would learn his lesson in a less costly way. The Academy's annual Interspecies Cultural Exchange Day transformed the normally austere halls into a kaleidoscope of alien traditions. Holographic displays showcased homeworlds, traditional music echoed through corridors, and the air was thick with exotic aromas from a dozen worlds. Sarah watched from her position near the Xenobiology Department's exhibition, where students demonstrated various species' unique biological adaptations. Her attention kept drifting to Kryzax and his group by the Nixilian display. Since the lab incident 3 weeks ago, he'd been unusually quiet, but she recognized the signs of something brewing. His scales had taken on the deep violet hue that Nixilians displayed when deep in concentrated planning. Professor Chen. Mira drifted closer, her bioluminescent tentacles pulsing with concern. The gravitational stabilizers for the heavy world species section are showing some unusual readings. Sarah frowned. The stabilizers were crucial. They created localized gravity fields allowing species from high-gravity worlds to move comfortably among others. A malfunction could be catastrophic. She accessed the control panel, her military training immediately spotting the problem. Someone had created a subtle feedback loop in the gravitational field generators. Left unchecked, it would cause a cascading failure, potentially crushing anyone in the affected area under intense gravitational forces. Evacuate the heavy world section, she ordered quietly, not wanting to cause panic. Mira, alert security but keep it discreet. A sharp crackling sound cut through the festivities. The gravitational field generators were failing faster than predicted. Sarah's combat instincts kicked in as she saw 3 young Graviton students still in the affected area, their crystalline bodies already showing stress fractures from the increasing pressure. Everyone back, she shouted, her command voice cutting through the growing chaos. But she knew the Graviton students couldn't move fast enough. Their silicon-based bodies, evolved for high gravity, made them paradoxically vulnerable to sudden gravitational changes. Sarah's hand found the emergency override panel. System. Recognize emergency protocol. Chen Alpha 7. Authorization. Solar Fleet Admiral Chen, Sarah. ID. 47,392X. The Academy's AI hesitated for a split second, processing the long-dormant military codes. Authorization recognized. Admiral Chen. Warning. Protocol will compromise civilian safety systems. Execute now. The override engage. Sarah felt the familiar surge of neural interface technology activating. Standard issue for Solar Fleet command staff, but classified beyond Academy knowledge. Her consciousness expanded, connecting directly with the facility systems. Through the interface, she could see the gravitational field structure, its failing containment, the precise calculations needed. Her augmented reflexes, honed through countless space battles, let her manually adjust the field harmonics faster than any organic being could manage. The generators screamed in protest as she forced them to create a controlled corridor of normal gravity. Move, she ordered the graviton students, her enhanced processing speed, letting her simultaneously reinforce the corridor and prevent the failing field from collapsing outward. The students stumbled to safety just as Sarah's body registered the strain of interfacing without proper military support systems. Blood trickled from her nose, a warning sign of neural feedback. She had seconds before the interface would cause permanent damage. With a final surge of effort, she initiated an emergency shutdown of the entire gravity system. The interface disengaged, leaving her gasping and dizzy but conscious. The hall fell silent except for the soft hum of emergency power systems. "Professor?" It was Krazax's voice, uncharacteristically uncertain. He stood at the system control panel, his scales pale with shock. I didn't mean." "Clear the hall," Sarah ordered, her voice hoarse but firm. "Security will want to examine everything." She fixed Krazax with a steady gaze, seeing not triumph at his exposure, but an opportunity for understanding. The young Nixilian's 4 eyes darted between her and the saved students. "The neural interface. That's restricted military technology. You're not just." "Admiral Sarah Chen," she confirmed quietly, former commander of the SSV Hyperion during the Centauri conflict. She wiped the blood from her nose. "The same ship that evacuated your father and the High Council when the swarm attacked your homeworld." Krazax's scales shifted through patterns of disbelief, realization, and finally, shame. The sealed records, they weren't about human failure in the conflict, were they? "No," Sarah said simply. "They were about cooperation, about how strength comes in many forms, and how survival often depends on seeing past our prejudices." She straightened, feeling the familiar weight of command settling back onto her shoulders. "Something I hope you'll consider during your disciplinary hearing." The hall had emptied except for security personnel beginning their investigation. Sarah watched Krazax being led away, seeing in his posture not the arrogant student of before, but something new, the beginning of understanding. Her neural implants throbbed, reminding her of the price of today's revelation. But as she looked at the saved students, she knew it had been worth it. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with weapons or ships, but with understanding and sacrifice. And sometimes, she reflected, the greatest victories came not from defeating an enemy, but from turning one into an ally. The Academy Council chamber felt smaller than Sarah remembered. Perhaps it was the presence of the Nixilian High Counselor himself, Krazax's father, his scales shimmering with the formal patterns of diplomatic authority. Or perhaps it was simply that she hadn't stood before a formal inquiry since the post-war hearings a decade ago. "Admiral Chen, or Professor Chen, as you're known here," began Council President Tulara, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light. "Your actions during the cultural exchange incident have raised significant questions." Sarah stood at parade rest, a habit she'd never quite lost. "I understand, Madam President. The use of classified military technology within an academic institution is unprecedented," rumbled High Counselor Vexfor, his son Krazax seated silently behind him. "Though I cannot deny its effectiveness in preventing casualties." The chamber's holoprojectors activated, displaying footage from the incident. Sarah watched her past self-interfacing with the Academy systems, blood trickling from her nose as she created the gravity corridor that saved the graviton students. "What interests us most," Tulara continued, "is why someone of your military significance chose to conceal their identity while teaching here." Sarah's gaze swept the chamber, taking in the mix of species representing the Academy's leadership. With respect, Madam President, I chose to teach here because knowledge should transcend military rank or species distinction. My experience was meant to inform my teaching, not overshadow it. And yet, Vexthor interjected, your military experience proved crucial in preventing what could have been a tragic event. His upper eyes fixed on Sarah, while his lower set darted briefly to his son. An event that our investigation reveals was orchestrated by those who questioned human capabilities. The chamber fell silent. Sarah could feel Krazax's gaze on her, but she kept her attention on the council. The incident demonstrated precisely why such prejudices are dangerous. Strength isn't determined by species or technology level, but by how we choose to use our capabilities. Indeed, Tilera's crystalline form shifted, creating patterns that indicated deep thought. Which brings us to the matter of consequences. Krazax stood abruptly. Council members, if I may speak. After a moment's hesitation, Tilera nodded. Sarah watched as the young Nixilian moved to the chamber center, his scales now showing patterns she'd never seen him display before. Humility. My actions were born of ignorance and pride. He began, his translator conveying the genuine remorse in his harmonics. I believe that my species' technological advancement made us superior. But Professor, Admiral Chen showed me that true superiority lies not in what technology we possess, but in how we choose to use it. He turned to face Sarah directly. She could have exposed my sabotage attempts immediately. She could have used her military authority to have me expelled. Instead, she chose to teach, not just xenobiology, but understanding. Even when I nearly caused a disaster, she risked her own safety to protect others, including those who had shown her nothing but contempt. The chamber remained silent as Krazax continued. I've accessed the unsealed records of the Centaur conflict. I've learned how the human fleet, under Admiral Chen's command, evacuated our capital when the swarm attacked. How they held the line not because they had superior technology, but because they refused to abandon allies in need. An interesting perspective, Tilera noted. What would you suggest as an appropriate response to these events? Krazax's scales shifted to formal patterns matching his father's. I accept full responsibility for my actions and any punishment the Council deems appropriate. But I also request that Admiral Chen be allowed to continue teaching, not just xenobiology, but perhaps also a new course on interspecies relations and conflict resolution. Sarah felt a surprising surge of pride. It wasn't often that one saw such profound transformation in a student. High Counselor Vexthor rose, his massive form commanding attention. My son's actions have brought shame to our family, he began, then paused, his scales shifting to patterns Sarah recognized from diplomatic meetings during the war. But his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them brings honor. Perhaps there is wisdom in having someone with Admiral Chen's unique perspective teaching our next generation. Tilera's crystalline form pulsed with what Sarah recognized as approval. Professor Chen, would you be willing to expand your teaching role as suggested? Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Knowledge is the best defense against prejudice, Madam President. I would be honored to continue serving in whatever capacity the Council deems appropriate. Very well, Tilera announced. Krazax will face restricted privileges and mandatory service in the Xenobiology Department, under Professor Chen's supervision. And the Academy will establish a new curriculum track focusing on interspecies understanding and conflict resolution, with Admiral Chen as its head instructor. As the chamber began to empty, Sarah noticed Krazax approaching, his father watching from a distance. The young Nixilian's scales now showed patterns she'd seen only in veteran diplomats, respect mixed with determination. Professor, he said quietly, I understand if you don't want me in your classes anymore. Sarah studied him for a moment. Actually, I think you're exactly where you need to be. Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons themselves. For the first time, she saw his scales ripple with patterns of hope. The war that had shaped her life had been fought to preserve the possibility of moments like this, when understanding could triumph over prejudice, and former adversaries could become the strongest allies. 1 year later, Sarah stood at her familiar spot by the Xenobiology Lab's viewport, watching the triple sunrise paint the academy spires. Behind her, students filed in for the graduation ceremony of her first interspecies relations and conflict resolution course. The class had become one of the Academy's most sought-after programs, with a waiting list spanning dozens of worlds. Krazax was arranging holographic displays showing key moments in galactic history, not just battles and technological achievements, but moments of cooperation and mutual understanding. His scales now regularly displayed the complex patterns of a mature diplomat, earned through months of hard work and genuine transformation. "Display check, Professor," he called out, his translator conveying the confidence he'd developed. The largest hologram showed the Battle of Proxima Centauri, but not the usual victory footage. Instead, it displayed the moment human ships broke formation to shield damaged Nixilian vessels, risking their own destruction to save former rivals. "Well chosen." Sarah nodded, noting how far he'd come from the arrogant student who'd once dismissed human achievements. "Though I think you missed one." She accessed the controls, adding another image. Yesterday's ceremony where Krazax had received the Academy's first Cross-Species Understanding Award. The committee had been particularly impressed by his thesis on the role of perceived technological superiority in interspecies conflicts. The graduation hall filled quickly. Sarah noticed how the seating had naturally integrated. Meridians floating near gravitons, Nixilians beside humans, patterns that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Among the attendees, she spotted High Counselor Vex Thor, his scales showing patterns of paternal pride that transcended species boundaries. "Students, faculty, honored guests," Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "Today marks not just the completion of a course, but the continuation of a journey. Each of you came here carrying certain beliefs about strength, about superiority, about what makes a species advanced." She gestured to the historical displays. "We've studied conflicts and cooperation, victories and failures, but the most important lesson wasn't in any textbook or simulation. It was in learning to see strength not as dominance over others, but as the ability to grow beyond our preconceptions." Krazax stepped forward, his scales shifting to formal academic patterns. "Professor Chen taught us that true advancement isn't measured by technology or military might, but by our capacity to learn from each other. My own journey from prejudice to understanding stands as testimony to this truth." Sarah watched as he activated one final hologram, a real-time display of the Academy's current species distribution and interaction patterns. The visualization showed clear evidence of increased cross-species collaboration and social integration. "This," she continued, "is what victory really looks like. Not the triumph of one species over another, but the success of all species learning to work together. Each of you will leave here today, carrying not just knowledge, but responsibility. The responsibility to share this understanding with your worlds." The ceremony proceeded with the formal presentation of credentials, but Sarah's attention was drawn to the subtle interactions. A meridian helping a graviton student adjust their gravitational field, a human and Nixilian discussing thesis collaborations, patterns of cooperation that had once seemed impossible. After the ceremony, Krazax approached her, his father beside him. "Professor," he said, his scales showing a complex pattern she'd never seen before. "The High Council has approved my proposal for an exchange program between the Academy and Nixilian military schools. With you as the program coordinator, I trust." Sarah smiled. "If you'll advise the project," he replied. "After all, who better to guide a program about overcoming military rivalries than the admiral who saved our capital?" High Counselor Vex Thor's scales shifted to diplomatic patterns. "The Council believes this initiative could help prevent future conflicts born of misunderstanding. Your experience would be invaluable, Admiral Chen." Sarah looked out at the triple suns, thinking of all the battles fought to reach this moment. The hardest war, she said quietly, is the one against our own prejudices, but it's also the most important to win. She turned back to them. I would be honored to help. As they discussed the details, Sarah noticed new students touring the academy, their eyes wide with wonder at the diversity around them. Among them was a young Nixilian, scales bright with curiosity rather than arrogance, asking questions of a human guide. The war that had shaped her life had been fought to preserve the possibility of moments like these, but the peace that followed would be maintained not through force of arms, but through understanding. Taught one student at a time, proven one connection at a time, until the very idea of species superiority became as obsolete as the weapons they'd once wielded. In the end, Sarah realized she hadn't retired from being a commander at all. She'd simply found a different kind of battle to fight, one where victory meant watching former adversaries become allies, and where strength was measured not in firepower, but in the courage to learn from those we once fought beneath us. The triple suns climbed higher, their light falling equally on all species gathered in the hall. And in that light, Sarah saw not just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of many more, each one a step toward a galaxy where understanding trumped prejudice, and where the greatest victories were won not through conflict, but through connection.